Hi there. I am so happy you found your way to Starlet Sinister tonight. I know you are here to escape the noise, so here is my promise. Only few short ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, silence. The rest of the video is completely ad-free so you can sleep undisturbed. I've dug deep to bring you fresh stories that you won't find anywhere else. I wanted to bring you something real. If that sounds good to you, a sub would help me a lot. Before you close your eyes, let me know one thing in the comments. What is the weather like outside your window right now? I love imagining where you all are listening from. Now, get comfortable. Let the dark in. Here is story number 1. Against the thin glass, something scraped once, slow and careful, like a fingernail testing if I was awake. Quietly, I stopped breathing and pressed my face into the pillow, counting my heartbeats so it wouldn't hear them. Although the room was dark, I knew exactly where I was because the smell of old wood and damp wool always hung in this place. Frozen and alert, my eyes stayed open, fixed on the narrow strip of light leaking under the door. In that moment, the scrape came again, closer this time, followed by a soft shift of weight on the porch boards. Slowly, my fingers curled into the blanket, gripping it like it could hold me in place. The house sat alone at the edge of a frozen orchard in northern Maine, a squat shape swallowed by snow and bare trees. Because winter had sealed everything shut, even small sounds traveled far, turning the quiet into something sharp. Hidden beneath 2 quilts, I listened to the scrape turn into a pause, as if whoever stood outside was deciding something. Gently, the wind pushed against the siding, but this sound did not move with it. The scrape stopped, and for a few seconds, nothing happened at all, while the silence stretched. My chest burned from holding air too long. In the pause, a new sound arrived, softer and worse. The faint click of the porch handle being touched, but not turned. Desperately, I swallowed and let out a breath through my nose, hoping it sounded like sleep. The handle did not move again, yet the presence stayed, close enough that I imagined heat where there should have been only cold. Because fear makes the mind wander, I pictured a face leaning close to the glass, waiting for me to move. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying dry snow across the porch in thin lines. Still and listening, I realized the scrape had come from the inside edge of the window frame, not the glass. At that thought, my stomach tightened, and I shifted just enough to feel the mattress creak. Immediately, the sound outside stopped, as if it had been listening for that exact signal. In the darkness, my eyes drifted to the door, half expecting to see the knob turning on its own. Instead, the handle stayed still, outlined by a faint glow from the hallway. The glow reminded me I wasn't alone in the house. Not truly, even if everyone else was asleep. Because of that, I told myself I was being stupid. That winter noises always sounded wrong at night. Slowly, the pressure near the window eased, and the cold draft faded from my neck. Relieved but unsettled, I waited for footsteps to retreat across the porch. Nothing retreated. The quiet simply reset, heavier than before. Against the wall, the old clock ticked once, loud enough to make me flinch. Although I wanted to check the window, I stayed still, afraid movement would invite the sound back. Minutes dragged without shape, measured only by the ache in my shoulders and the slow return of breath. Somewhere in the house, wood popped as the heat struggled against the cold. Eventually, my eyes burned and sleep threatened to pull me under whether I wanted it or not. Just as my thoughts began to blur, a soft knock landed on the door. Not loud, not urgent, just a single tap placed carefully at shoulder height. Instinctively, I turned my head toward the sound, every muscle tight. The knock did not repeat. Instead, a faint drag brushed down the door, as if someone were lowering their hand very slowly. In that second, I knew this was not weather, not animals, and not the house settling. Because fear had finally settled into clarity, I stayed silent, letting it think I wasn't there. The drag reached the bottom of the door and stopped. For a long time, nothing followed. When the quiet finally broke, it wasn't with sound but with absence. The sense that whatever had been waiting had made a choice. Exhausted and shaking, I stared at the door until pale morning light crept under it. That winter was the first time I learned how loud a house can be when it wants your attention. At the time, I didn't think much of it, because I still believed fear needed a reason. Although later moments would prove me wrong, that night stayed with me as a warning I didn't understand yet. Some things don't rush you, they just wait until you notice them. In the weak morning light, the door looked ordinary again, just chipped paint and an old brass handle. Carefully, I sat up and listened, waiting for some proof that the night had been real. Because nothing moved, I told myself I had imagined it. That winter does strange things to sound. Still tense, I slipped out of bed and crossed the room without turning on the light. In the hallway, cold air brushed my ankles, carrying the smell of dust and something metallic. Quietly, I leaned down and pressed my ear to the door, half expecting to hear breathing on the other side. Nothing answered me. Relieved but uneasy, I opened the door and stepped into the hall. The house stood empty and still, frozen in that early hour pause before anyone wakes. Although the porch was visible through the front window, no tracks marked the snow. In the kitchen, I poured coffee with shaking hands and watched steam rise like it was alive. Because sleep felt impossible, I stayed there, waiting for the sun to climb higher. Later, when voices finally filled the rooms, I said nothing about the night. At the time, it felt normal to keep quiet, like talking might give the sound a name. Over the following hours, the house never quite settled back into itself. Every floorboard creak made my shoulders jump. Every draft felt aimed at my neck. In the afternoon, I tried to distract myself by cleaning, moving from room to room with the radio playing softly. Although music helped, it also made the quiet between songs feel deeper. Near the front door, I noticed faint marks along the frame, thin lines running downward. Carefully, I touched them, finding the wood rough where something had scraped. Because no one else mentioned it, I convinced myself it had always been there. Still unsettled, I avoided the door for the rest of the day. As evening returned, shadows gathered early, pressed close by the snow outside. Slowly, the familiar tightness crept back into my chest, the same feeling from the night before. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house breathe around me. Although exhaustion weighed heavy, I kept the light on longer than usual. When I finally turned it off, darkness rushed in fast, thicker than it should have been. Instinctively, I held my breath again, waiting for the scrape to return. It didn't come from the window this time. Instead, a soft sound rose from the hallway, like fabric brushing against the wall. Because fear sharpens attention, I recognized the sound immediately. It was the same slow slide I had heard in the night, careful and deliberate. Under the door, a shadow shifted, stretching and shrinking as if something leaned closer. Frozen and watching, I stayed perfectly still. The slide stopped right outside my room. For a moment, the house felt balanced on a thin edge, waiting. Quietly, a pressure touched the door, not pushing, just resting there. Desperately, I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing for morning to come faster. The pressure lifted, replaced by a faint tap, no louder than a fingernail. Because it came at the height of my shoulder, I knew it wasn't an accident. Tap. Pause. Another tap followed, slightly lower than the first. Although I wanted to scream, my throat refused to work. In the silence after, something shifted its weight, close enough that the door seemed to hold it up. Slowly, the handle turned just enough to make a soft click. I pressed myself back against the wall, heart pounding so hard it hurt. That was when I realized the sound wasn't trying to get in. It was checking if the door was locked. In that frozen pause, I understood it wasn't confused about where I was. Because of the careful way it tested the handle, it already knew the room, the door, and the space my body took behind it. Against the wall, my back slid lower until I was sitting on the floor. Quietly, I pulled my knees in, trying to make myself smaller without making a sound. The handle eased back to its resting place with a soft click. Although relief tried to surface, it never fully arrived. Outside the door, something shifted again, closer to the frame this time. Slowly, the fabric sound returned, brushing once along the wood like a sleeve. In my chest, panic bloomed in short, sharp bursts. I had to swallow down. Because the hallway light was off, I imagined the dark pressed right up against the crack beneath the door. The brushing stopped, replaced by a stillness that felt deliberate. Hidden in that quiet, a faint warmth touched the other side of the door, wrong against the winter air. I counted my breaths, afraid that even the sound of air moving might give me away. Were my lungs burned? I let a little out through my nose, barely enough to survive. Minutes stretched without shape or order. Somewhere far off, pipes knocked as the heat kicked on, loud enough to make me flinch. In the pause that followed, the presence shifted one last time. Carefully, something leaned close to the door, close enough that I imagined a forehead resting there. No knock came. No voice followed. Instead, a slow retreat began, marked by the soft slide of fabric and the faintest creak of floorboards. Because it moved away without hurry, I knew it wasn't finished, only satisfied for now. I stayed on the floor long after the sound faded, afraid to test the silence. When my legs finally went numb, I forced myself up and locked the door again, even though it already was. By morning, exhaustion had dulled the edges of fear, but it hadn't erased it. That night left something behind, a certainty I couldn't explain yet. Although I didn't understand what it wanted, I knew it had learned something important. It had learned where I slept, how quietly I breathed, and how long I could stay still. In the same spot by the door, I stayed standing long after the sound was gone, afraid that sitting down would mean giving up. Quietly, I pressed my palm against the wood, feeling cold where warmth had been only moments before. Although nothing touched back, the house no longer felt empty. Because the silence felt watched, I left the room with the light on and moved to the kitchen without turning my back to the hall. In the kitchen chair, my body folded in on itself, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on the doorway. Slowly, the clock ticks began to sound wrong, each one spaced like it was waiting for me to react. The first real change came without noise. Against the far wall, the dark seemed thicker, like shadow settling where it hadn't before. While my mind tried to explain it away, my chest stayed tight, refusing comfort. At the time, it felt normal to stay still, as if motion would teach the house something new. From the hallway, a faint warmth drifted in, out of place in the cold night. Because heat carries memory, it reminded me of a body standing too close. I didn't sleep again after that. By morning, my thoughts felt bruised, slow to form, heavy with unsaid fear. In the daylight, the house looked smaller, almost harmless. Still uneasy, I checked the door frame again and found the marks deeper than before. The grooves were fresh. Although I wanted proof it wasn't just me, I didn't ask anyone else to look. In the afternoon, fatigue settled into my bones, making my hands shake when I poured water. Quietly, I started noticing small changes, things out of place without reason. A chair angled differently. A mug moved from one counter to another. Because none of it crossed into damage, I doubted myself. Doubt, I learned, makes fear patient. That night, I slept on the couch with the hallway light on. Against my better judgment, my eyes closed anyway. Sometime later, weight pressed down near my feet. Frozen in place, I felt the cushion sink like someone kneeling. The pressure didn't move. Instead, it waited, heavy and exact. In that stillness, my toes curled on their own, trying to pull away without shifting the cushion. Quietly, I counted breaths again, afraid the rhythm might give me away. Although the weight stayed near my feet, the sense of it leaned upward, like a tension moving instead of mass. Because fear sharpens details, I noticed the couch fabric pulling tight where nothing should have been. The hallway light flickered once and steadied. Against the far wall, my shadow looked wrong, stretched too tall for my body. I wanted to call out, but my mouth stayed closed. At the time, it felt safer to let it think I was asleep. Slowly, the pressure slid closer, inch by inch, careful not to rush. Hidden under the blanket, my hands shook so hard the fabric trembled. The couch dipped near my knees. Although no sound came with it, the warmth returned, faint and wrong. In my head, memories stacked on top of each other without order. Because it had tested the door before, I knew it was learning again. The pressure paused, as if waiting for permission. Quietly, my breath hitched, despite every effort to stop it. That was enough. The weight shifted, heavier now, closer to my center. I felt the cushion sink beside my hip. Frozen and wide-eyed, I stared at the hallway where the light no longer reached. In that dark edge, something blocked the glow. Although I couldn't see it, the shape felt familiar. It matched my height. It matched the way I leaned when I was tired. The thought landed harder than fear. Because if it could copy that much, it didn't need me awake anymore. The pressure settled fully, complete and sure. I stayed still, understanding too late that this was not a visit. In the narrow space between breaths, I stopped trying to escape the feeling. Quietly, my body went loose, like it understood before my mind did. Although fear still lived in my chest, it no longer pushed me to move, because the weight had learned my shape. Fighting felt like teaching it more. The pressure shifted one last time, settling in the way I always did before sleep, against the back of my legs, warmth spread, steady and calm. I realized then it wasn't holding me down. It was holding its place. In the silence, my thoughts thinned until they felt borrowed. Slowly, the line between where I ended and where it began softened. The hallway light came back on by itself, faint and yellow. Although it should have brought comfort, it only showed the couch empty from the outside. From the inside, I felt full, because something else was resting exactly where I always rested. I stayed there until morning came and went without meaning. At some point, the house began moving again, unaware anything had changed. Now when the lights are off and rooms fall quiet, I still feel that careful pressure. It never leaves because it doesn't need to follow me. I am already where it waits. Story number 2. Against the window glass, something tapped twice in quick succession, sharp enough to pull me fully awake. My hand froze halfway to the lamp as I waited for it to happen again. In the dark room, the sound felt too close, placed with care instead of accident. Cold crept up my arms while I counted the seconds between my breaths. The building sat alone at the edge of a grain yard in rural Saskatchewan, surrounded by flat land and long rows of steel silos. At night, there were no nearby houses and no traffic sounds, only wind and the low groan of metal settling. Back then, I worked nights as a scale clerk, logging deliveries that came in before dawn. The job stayed quiet, repetitive, lonely in a way that felt comforting after a while. That winter came early, laying snow down in thin, uneven sheets that reflected almost no light. The yard lights cast weak yellow circles that barely reached the far fence. The tapping came again, same rhythm and same place on the glass. My stomach tightened as I sat up on the narrow cot behind the office desk. From the window, nothing moved. The yard lay empty, tire tracks frozen in place. Shadows stretched thin across the snow. I told myself it was ice shifting or a bird hitting the glass. My knees stayed anyway as I slipped my boots on and stood with my back to the wall. The office smelled like old coffee and dust, a familiar mix that usually settled my nerves. That night it did nothing. Another tap landed, slower this time. It came from the lower corner of the window, too deliberate to ignore. I leaned closer without making noise. The glass felt colder than usual, biting through my sleeve when I brushed it. Outside, a shape stood just beyond the reach of the light. It stayed low and narrow, barely breaking the line between snow and darkness. My mouth went dry as I watched it shift. The movement stayed smooth and controlled, without the panic of an animal caught in the open. The shape edged forward until part of it caught the light. A bicycle wheel emerged, rim dull and spokes dark with rust. No rider stood beside it. No footsteps marked the snow nearby. The bike rolled another inch on its own and stopped. The tapping did not return. I stepped back, heart thudding loud enough to feel in my throat. The room felt smaller, the ceiling pressing down as if listening. Years earlier, I would have gone outside without thinking. That night, the quiet part of me warned against it. The radio on the desk crackled to life, static spilling into the room. I hadn't touched it. The sound made me jump, knocking my elbow against the desk. Paper slid to the floor, numbers scattering out of order. I turned the radio off and stood still again. The silence that followed felt thicker than before. The bicycle remained where it was, half-lit and perfectly upright. No kickstand held it in place. I watched for a long time, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, the cold in the room pushed me to move. I locked the door, though it felt pointless, and sat back down in the cot. Sleep came in short, uneven stretches. Each time I drifted off, the image of the wheel crept back in. By morning, the sky lightened to a dull gray. Snow began falling again, soft and steady. When I stepped outside at shift change, the yard looked untouched. The bicycle was gone. Only a thin track marked the snow near the window, a single line leading away from the light. It disappeared between the silos, swallowed by drift and shadow. I told no one about it. At the time, it felt easier to keep quiet than explain something without a name. The next nights passed without incident. Work settled back into its routine. Numbers came and went. Trucks rolled through, and the radio stayed silent. I almost convinced myself the tapping had been a dream. Near the end of the week, the wind picked up. Metal rang softly across the yard as the silos shifted in the cold. I was filling out a log sheet when a familiar sound reached me. A light tap, placed carefully against the glass. My pen stopped moving. The room felt instantly smaller again. Outside, the bicycle stood in the same spot as before, angled slightly toward the door. Snow clung to the tires, fresh and clean. This time, something rested on the seat. A knit cap, dark and worn, sagged under its own weight. I recognized it before I could stop myself. It matched one I had lost years earlier, back when I still rode into town. The realization landed slow and heavy. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, pale and unsure. The cap slid off the seat and dropped into the snow. No hand moved to push it. I stayed where I was, watching breath fog the window. The bike did not leave. Across the grain yard, the wind dragged loose snow in thin lines that erased their own paths. My eyes stayed on the bicycle, while my body refused to move toward the door. Inside the office, the heater clicked on and off, pushing weak warmth that never reached my hands. The knit cap lay where it had fallen, dark against the white ground. I forced myself to look away long enough to finish the log sheet. The numbers came out crooked, pressed too hard into the paper. At shift change, daylight crept in slowly, turning the silos dull and flat. When I stepped outside, the bicycle and the cap were gone again. Only the snow remained, smooth and unbroken. No tracks led away this time. I walked the yard once, boots crunching loud in the quiet. Nothing looked disturbed, and the fence lines ran straight and empty. The rest of that day passed without weight. Sleep took me fast and deep, the way it does after a long night. By the time I returned for my next shift, dusk had already settled. The sky held that washed-out blue that comes before full dark. The yard lights hummed on one by one. Their glow felt weaker than before. Inside the office, everything sat where I'd left it. The radio stayed silent and the desk clear. Hours moved by without sound. My shoulders eased just a little. Near midnight, a low scrape came from outside. It dragged along the metal siding, slow and steady. I stood and listened, breath shallow. The scrape stopped near the window. In the glass, my reflection wavered. Something darker stood just beyond it. The bicycle rolled into view again, guided by no one. Its front wheel turned until it faced the door. A second shape followed it this time. Tall and narrow, wrapped in a coat that hung too loose. The figure stopped short of the light. Its face stayed hidden, head bowed. I waited for fear to spike. It never did. The feeling that settled felt heavier and quieter. Recognition without reason. The door handle turned once, just enough to test it. Metal clicked softly. I did not reach for the lock. My hands rested flat on the desk, useless. Outside, the figure straightened, its head lifted toward the window. Even through the glass and shadow, I knew the shape of that posture. I had stood the same way more times than I could count. The bicycle tipped forward and fell onto its side. The sound rang sharp across the yard. The figure stepped back with it. Both vanished together into the dark beyond the lights. I stayed inside until morning again. The yard returned to stillness. When daylight came, the snow showed signs of passage. 2 sets of prints crossed the yard and stopped at the fence. Only one set led away. Along the fence line, the snow dipped where something had leaned its weight before moving on. I stood over the marks longer than I should have, trying to understand how two paths became one. In the quiet daylight, the yard looked harmless again. Steel, snow, and distance arranged themselves into something normal. I went home after my shift and slept through the afternoon. Dreams came in pieces, none sharp enough to remember. By the time I woke, dusk slid back over the fields. The thought of returning to work sat heavy in my chest. The drive back felt longer than usual. Road signs passed without meaning, and the radio stayed off. At the grain yard, the lights flickered on as they always did. Nothing looked out of place at first glance. Inside the office, the air felt colder than it should have. The heater hummed, but the chill stayed close to the walls. I sat down and opened the logbook. The page waited, blank and patient. Minutes stretched. Wind moved through the silos with a low, steady moan. From outside, a sound drifted in that did not belong to metal or weather. Rubber rolled slowly across packed snow. I did not look up right away. My eyes stayed on the page, tracing lines without seeing them. The sound stopped just outside the window. Breath fogged the glass from the other side. When I finally raised my head, the bicycle stood there again, closer than before. Its handlebars faced the window. The front tire pressed into the snow hard enough to leave a deep curve. Behind it, the tall shape waited. No coat this time, the outline matched mine too well. Shoulders sloped the same way, head angled forward in the same tired bend. The figure lifted its arm. My arm lifted too. The movement was not a mirror. It happened a breath before I realized I had done it. A knock landed on the glass, same height as my shoulder. The sound carried through the room and settled deep. I felt it in my teeth. My hand hovered over the desk phone. I did not pick it up. Outside, the figure leaned closer. The glass bowed slightly under the pressure. The bicycle shifted on its side, tire turning once. Snow whispered under the movement. In the window, my reflection and the shadow merged. I could no longer tell which parts belonged to me. The knock came again, stronger this time. Something inside the room answered without sound, a sense of being called by name. Though no voice spoke, my chair scraped as I stood. The figure straightened too. Between us, the glass held. For now, I reached for the lock on the door. My hand stopped inches away. Outside, the bicycle began to roll toward the dark beyond the lights. The figure followed it, step for step. At the edge of the yard, both paused. The shape turned its head once, slow and deliberate. Even from that distance, I knew what it was waiting for. Against the desk edge, my fingers pressed harder than I realized, nails biting into the wood. The yard stayed empty after that pause, lights humming like nothing had been tested. In the hours that followed, nothing returned. No knock came back, and no shadow crossed the snow. The stillness should have helped. It didn't. When my shift finally ended, daylight arrived without relief. The sun made the silos look harmless, like tall toys left behind. I walked the fence again, slower this time. The place where the bicycle had stopped felt colder than the rest of the yard. At home, sleep refused to settle. Each time I closed my eyes, the knock replayed at shoulder height. By the time I returned the next night, my body felt hollow. Fatigue dulled fear, turning it heavy instead of sharp. The yard lights came on, one by one, same order as always. Their glow reached the fence and stopped. Inside the office, I checked the window first. The glass showed only my reflection in drifting snow. The logbook opened to the next page. My name was already written there. I stood still, reading it again. The handwriting matched mine, careful and slanted. I had not written it. At least, I could not remember doing it. Ben lay capped beside the book. Ink on its tip looked fresh. I sat down slowly. The chair creaked in the same tired way it always had. For a while, nothing happened. Minutes passed, maybe more. From outside, the faint roll of rubber returned. Not fast, not rushed. The bicycle appeared at the edge of the light, moving with quiet patience. This time it stopped farther back, just short of where it had been before. Behind it, the shape followed. Its steps matched the space between my breaths. I did not look at its face. I watched the ground instead. The snow beneath its feet did not compress. No print formed. The knock did not come right away. The waiting felt deliberate. My reflection in the glass shifted as I leaned closer without meaning to. The other shape leaned too. In that moment, the pause made sense. It wasn't asking permission. It was waiting for recognition. My mouth opened, then closed again. No sound felt safe enough to use. Outside, the bicycle tipped slightly, correcting itself without help. The figure's head lifted. Even without seeing its eyes, the attention settled on me. The feeling carried the weight of muscle memory. I stepped back from the window. The figure did the same. The distance between us stayed the same. That felt worse than if it had closed in. I reached for the desk phone again. My hand hovered, shaking. The receiver stayed heavy in its cradle. No dial tone would have helped. From the yard, the knock finally came, once, careful, exact. It landed where my shoulder would rest if I leaned forward. The glass hummed under it. Something in my chest loosened instead of tightening. Fear gave way to a colder understanding. This was not a warning anymore. It was a reminder. The figure outside straightened. So did I. In the reflection, our movements blurred together. I could no longer tell who led. The bicycle rolled forward a single turn. Snow whispered under the tire. I thought of the fence line, the two paths becoming one. The memory felt less like fear and more like instruction. My hand lowered from the phone. The receiver stayed untouched. Outside, the figure turned its head toward the dark beyond the lights. The bicycle followed its gaze. I felt the pull then, soft and steady. Not toward the door, but toward the space where the light stopped. The knock did not repeat. It didn't need to. I stayed where I was until my legs ached. Outside, the bicycle and the figure did not move. When the shift ended, the clock changed without ceremony. Daylight arrived again, pale and flat. I walked out into the yard with the same steps I always used. Snow creaked under my boots, loud in the open space. Nothing waited by the window. Fence stood clear, the ground smooth. The absence felt heavier than any knock. It followed me home and settled into the corners of the rooms. Sleep came late and left early. Dreams drifted in pieces, all of them quiet. By the next night, my body moved through routine without thought. Keys, lights, desk, window. The logbook lay open. Another line had been added beneath my name. The handwriting stayed the same. So did the pressure in my chest. I did not erase it. I sat and waited. Hours passed without sound. The yard stayed empty. Near the end of the shift, the lights flickered once. The glow stopped short of the fence again. The bicycle appeared without warning, already in place. Its tires rested on snow that looked untouched. The figure stood beside it, closer than before. No coat, no shadow. I felt no urge to step back. My feet stayed planted. The knock came once, soft. It landed lower this time, closer to my chest. I leaned forward before thinking. The glass felt cold and familiar. In the reflection, the space between us thinned. The lines blurred. Outside, the figure lifted its hand. Inside, mine rose to meet it. The glass did not break. It did not need to. Something eased in my shoulders, a tension I had carried without knowing. The feeling spread, slow and sure. The bicycle tipped forward and rolled away from the light. The figure turned with it. I followed the movement with my eyes, not my body. That was enough. When they reached the edge of the yard, both stopped. The figure looked back once. No warning came, no goodbye either. The yard returned to stillness. The lights hummed on. In the logbook, the last line waited. I closed the cover without reading it. At home, sleep finally came clean and deep. No dreams followed. The next shift passed quietly. The window stayed clear. Still, some nights the light ends a little sooner than it should. The fence feels closer. I no longer reach for the phone when that happens. I sit and wait. In the weeks that followed, nothing else appeared at the window. No bicycle, no shape, no careful mark placed at the height of my body. The yard kept its distance, behaving the way places do when they decide not to explain themselves. Snow fell, melted, and fell again. I stayed on nights longer than I planned. The routine felt easier than imagining something different. Each shift began the same way. Lights on, window checked, blog book opened. My name was always there now, written before I arrived. The ink never smeared, never faded. I stopped trying to remember when I first wrote it. The effort felt unnecessary. Some nights, the sound of rubber felt present beyond the fence. Not close enough to see, only close enough to know. Other nights stayed perfectly silent. Those were harder. The reflection in the glass changed slowly over time, not in ways anyone else would notice. My shoulders rested differently. My head tilted at a familiar angle. Once, I caught myself lifting my arm for no reason. The motion stopped halfway. I stood there a long time, watching my hand hover. It felt like waiting for someone else to decide. At home, the silence followed me. Rooms felt less separate than before. Sleep stayed deep and dreamless. Waking felt thin. On a clear night, late in the season, the yard lights reached farther than usual. The fence line showed every post and bend. At the edge of that light, a shape waited. No bicycle this time. It stood where the ground dipped, right where the two paths had become one. The posture was relaxed and patient. Fear did not come. Recognition settled fully. The glass between us reflected only one figure. I couldn't tell which side it belonged to. The knock never came again. It didn't need to. Some nights, I still sit at the desk after my shift ends. The yard waits with me. The log book stays closed now. There is nothing left to add. When the light shortens and the fence feels close, I don't look away. I don't reach for help. I already know how this place keeps track of me. And I know I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. Story number 3. In the narrow stairwell, a wet footprint appeared on the concrete step below mine. My body stopped before my thoughts did. The sound came again, soft and close, like fabric brushing a wall. I held my breath and waited for it to pass. Down the hall, the exit sign buzzed and dimmed. The building did not feel asleep. I lived on the 4th floor of a narrow apartment block near the docks, one of those buildings that smelled like rust and old water even on clear days. Rain pressed against the windows most nights, steady and patient. At 26, my job kept me indoors more than I liked. Editing transcripts paid the bills and silence helped me focus. Friends were still a city away. Most evenings ended with a lamp, a screen, and the slow tick of the radiator. Across the hall, the unit stayed empty for months. No lights, no voices, no movement. The landlord said it was being sorted out. That phrase never meant much. One evening, the door across from mine stood open. Only an inch, just enough to notice. Inside, the apartment looked darker than it should have. The light from the hallway did not seem to travel far. I paused with my keys in hand. The smell reached me first. It reminded me of wet cardboard and cold metal. Not strong, just present. I locked my door and told myself it was nothing. Old buildings carried old smells. The next night, something shifted. The hallway sounded longer. Footsteps echoed where they usually didn't. Each one landed slow, careful. From my door, I listened without opening it. The steps stopped across from me. The empty unit's door closed. The sound was gentle, almost polite. Sleep came late. Dreams stayed shallow. In the morning, a note waited on my doormat. No envelope, no name. The paper felt damp. Ink bled slightly through the fibers. It held a single line written neatly. You hear it too. I threw it away before finishing my coffee. The trash lid snapped louder than expected. Days passed without signs. The rain stayed. At work, words blurred together. Sentences lost their edges. One night, the power flickered. My lamp dimmed and steadied. From the hallway, a low sound followed, not a voice, not a hum. It felt like someone clearing their throat in another room. The sound repeated, closer. I opened the door a fraction. The hall stood empty. Water pooled near the stairwell. Footprints marked a path toward the empty unit. They stopped at its door. None returned. Inside my apartment, the air felt thick. I locked the door and sat on the floor. Later, a knock came, single, soft. The sound touched the wood at shoulder height. I did not answer. A second knock followed, slower. The space between them felt measured. My phone sat face down beside me. The screen stayed dark. From the other side, a voice spoke, low, careful. "It's leaking," it said, "down here." The words did not rush. They waited. I pressed my hand to the door. Cold bled through the paint. "No maintenance tonight," the voice added. "I just need you to see." My name followed, spoken correctly. The hallway light flickered again. Shadows stretched thin. I backed away without sound. The knock did not repeat. Minutes passed. The presence stayed. When the door across the hall opened, the sound carried weight. Something scraped along the floor. Through the peephole, movement crossed my view. A shape bent low, dragging something narrow. The empty unit swallowed it. The door closed. Sleep never arrived that night. Morning came gray and flat. At work, I reread the same line for an hour. My hands shook without reason. That evening, the landlord called. His voice sounded tired. He asked if I had noticed anything strange. The unit across from mine had been reassigned. I did not ask what that meant. I said no. After the call, the hallway filled with sound. Furniture shifted. Boxes slid. Someone hummed off-key. The tune felt old. I stayed inside until quiet returned. The rain did not stop. Near midnight, water seeped under my door, a thin line, slow and steady. I knelt and touched it, ice cold. From across the hall, a knock landed again. Same height, same care. This time it came from inside my apartment. Inside the apartment, the knock echoed in the wrong place. My heart jumped before my mind could argue. The sound came again, closer to the kitchen wall. Wood answered it with a dull, hollow note. I stood still, counting breaths the way I used to during edits. Slow in, slower out. From the hallway side, nothing moved. The peephole showed only the long, wet carpet and the dim light at the stairwell. Behind me, water continued to creep across the floor. It followed the baseboard, careful not to rush. I stepped back, heel brushing the couch. The knock shifted again. This time it landed near the bathroom door. Same height, same pressure. My phone vibrated in my hand without a notification. The screen stayed dark. The radiator clicked once, then fell quiet. The apartment felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in. Against the bathroom tile, the sound returned, softer, almost thoughtful. I shook my head without realizing. No, slipped out, barely formed. Silence followed. Not relief, just pause. The water stopped moving. It pooled and waited. From the ceiling, a faint scrape traveled across the plaster. Not footsteps, something slower. I pressed my back to the counter, eyes fixed on the hallway door. My breath fogged the air. The scrape reached the wall above me. Dust fell in a thin line. In the quiet, I heard humming. The same off-key tune from earlier. It came from everywhere, nowhere, like sound traveling through pipes. The bathroom door creaked open an inch. I hadn't touched it. Inside, the light flicked on by itself. Yellow, weak. The mirror over the sink caught movement behind me. A shape crossed the reflection, tall and close. I turned too fast. The kitchen stood empty. My reflection lagged a second longer than it should have. Then it matched me again. Water dripped from the ceiling into the sink. Each drop landed with intent. From the hallway, a door opened, not mine. Across the hall, the empty unit breathed. A long exhale. The knock returned, gentle now. It landed on my bedroom wall. I backed toward the door, keys digging into my palm. The deadbolt felt farther away than it should have. The humming stopped. That felt worse. In the quiet, a voice spoke from inside the walls. Not loud, not urgent. Still time, it said. The words traveled slowly. The water began to drain on its own, pulling away from my feet. The floor dried too fast. I reached the door and twisted the lock. Metal protested, then gave. The hallway waited, long and wet. The light flickered once. From the empty unit, a chair scraped softly across the floor. It stopped near the threshold. I stepped out, closing my door behind me without a sound. The knock did not follow. The door across the hall stood open now. Inside, something shifted, patient. My feet moved before I chose to, toward the dark. And just before I crossed the threshold, I noticed the masking tape on the chair, a name written in careful black ink. It was mine. In the doorway, the smell settled into my clothes before I could step back. Cold air pressed against my face. The chair sat exactly in the center of the room. Nothing else had been moved. Around it, the apartment felt hollowed out. Walls stood bare, stripped of sound. I stayed where I was, one hand on the frame. The hallway light buzzed behind me. On the floor, water had traced careful lines. They led inward, stopping at the chair legs. The tape with my name peeled slightly at one corner. The ink had bled the way it does in damp places. I didn't step closer. The room didn't ask me to. From above, something shifted between floors. A slow adjustment, like weight being settled. The humming returned, softer now. It matched my breathing without effort. I thought about the stairwell, about running. The thought felt distant. Inside the room, the light changed, not brighter, more certain. A second chair scraped once, just enough to be heard. It stopped behind me. I didn't turn. The space felt measured, complete. Against the back of my neck, the air cooled. Close enough to notice, the tape lifted and fell, sticking again. My name stayed where it was. I understood then why the knocks had moved, why the water had waited. This place wasn't trying to get in. It was arranging. The humming slowed, so did I. Somewhere in the building, pipes sighed and went still. The rain outside softened. I took one step forward, meaning to stop before the chair. My foot didn't land where I expected. The floor dipped just slightly, enough to guide me. Behind me, the door eased shut without a sound. The hallway light cut off. In the dark, the chair waited, and I began to sit. Into the chair, my weight settled slower than gravity should allow. The wood did not creak. Around me, the room seemed to listen. Every surface held still, as if movement had been finished already. Behind my eyes, a pressure built, not pain, just awareness. The kind that comes when a sentence reaches its last word. From somewhere close, breath moved that wasn't mine. It matched my rhythm too well. I stayed where I was, hands resting on my knees, waiting for the next instruction that did not arrive. The dark felt organized now, and in that held moment before anything else could happen, I understood that standing up was no longer part of the design. Into the chair, the room adjusted around me as if this had been rehearsed. The air felt warmer near the floor. Against my palms, the wood held a faint vibration. Not movement, more like readiness. The humming settled into a lower pitch. It felt satisfied. In the dark, the outline of the room returned in pieces. Edges first, then corners. Behind me, the second chair did not move. Its presence stayed exact. I waited for pain, for panic, for something sharp. None of it arrived. What came instead was memory, not mine. Images drifted in without order. A stairwell at night, a door left open, a name spoken carefully. The pressure behind my eyes eased as each piece found its place. Nothing felt forced. Somewhere above, water ran through pipes again. The sound felt distant now. I realized I could breathe without counting. That surprised me. From the wall to my left, A faint line appeared, chalk white, against the dark brick. It traced a shape I had seen before without knowing where, a pattern meant to be followed. The chair beneath me shifted a fraction, just enough to align. I understood then what the knocking had been for. Not a warning, not an invitation, a correction. Time stopped behaving the way I expected. Moments stretched thin and even. The room did not watch me. It waited with me. In that shared stillness, something loosened inside my chest. A tension I had carried since moving in. I thought about my apartment across the hall, about the desk, the lamp, the lock. Those things felt smaller now, like objects left behind in another life. The humming faded almost completely. What remained felt like listening. My hands rested where they had been placed. They did not tremble. I wondered if someone would knock again. The thought felt unnecessary. In the dark, a breath moved that was not mine. It stayed close, careful not to rush. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to finish something that had been left open. The sense of being chosen settled, not as fear, but as purpose. Against the back of the chair, my spine settled as if it had found its mark. The room felt finished. From somewhere close, the air shifted again. Not a touch, just acknowledgement. I opened my eyes to the dark and felt no urge to stand. That choice no longer felt available. The pattern on the wall faded, its work done. Brick returned to brick. Inside my chest, something clicked into place. Not relief, not fear. Acceptance arrived without ceremony. It felt ordinary. I stayed there, breathing evenly, while the room held its shape. Nothing rushed me. For the first time since moving into the building, waiting felt deliberate. It felt chosen. From the corner of the room, pressure changed shape again. Not sound, not silence. The second chair shifted just enough to be felt. Wood answered wood. I did not turn. There was no reason to check what had already been arranged. Behind my eyes, another memory surfaced, a feeling of being watched with patience. The room seemed larger now, stretching past the walls I knew. Distance behaved differently. I thought of the hallway once more. The idea slid away. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. The sound arrived dull and filtered. The chair beneath me stayed steady. That steadiness mattered. I noticed the humming had stopped completely. The silence felt earned, and that quiet weight appeared beside me, not touching, just present. Breath moved again that wasn't mine. Slower than before. I counted once, then stopped. Counting felt unnecessary. The air cooled near my ankles like a door opening far below, a draft without direction. I became aware of the building itself, not walls or floors, but something listening back. The second chair creaked softly, a polite sound. This was not an ending, it was a position being held. My name passed through my thoughts without sound. It felt like alignment. The room did not close in, it settled. In the stillness that followed, the space no longer felt like a room. It felt like a role filled. The weight beside me shifted once, settling deeper. No words came with it. I understood why the chair had waited, why my name had been written before I arrived. This was never about fear. It was about fit. The building exhaled her pipes and brick. Rain finally stopped somewhere above. I loosened in small ways. Shoulders first, then hands. The idea of leaving crossed my mind once. It passed without resistance. Nothing blocked the door. Nothing needed to. In the dark, I realized how long I had mistaken motion for choice, how rarely I had sat still. The chair held me exactly as intended. No adjustment required. Beside me, the other presence remained quiet. Watching was no longer necessary. The building knew where I was now, and I knew where I belonged within it. When morning came, it arrived without light, only continuation. I stayed seated, breathing evenly, part of the arrangement that needed no explanation. Standing up was no longer something I would do. Story number 4. Under the weak glow of the back security light, snow kept falling in a way that erased sound. Although the building behind me stayed warm and awake in small ways, the garden felt cut loose, quiet and padded. The night pressed close, like it didn't want to travel far. Slowly, I noticed I couldn't remember how long I'd been standing there. Inside the assisted living home, time usually behaved itself, because routines mattered there. Everything followed a shape I could rely on. Orderly and predictable medication rounds and hallway checks kept my hands busy. Quietly, work helped me avoid thinking about anything else. I took the night shifts because they were easier to explain than my reasons. Although people assumed it was about extra pay, that wasn't it. Tired and careful, I liked when the world asked less of me. Slowly, nights became a place to hide. At the start of each shift, I always checked the same things. Because habit felt safer than thought, I followed the list without change. Methodical and dull, doors, lights, and monitors kept me moving. Quietly, I liked how none of it required feeling. Most evenings, I stepped outside once the residents settled. Because the hall stayed too warm, the cold felt clean. Sharp and honest, it reminded me I still had a body. Quietly, I told myself these breaks helped me focus. Behind the building, the garden waited in winter silence. Although it was meant for summer visits, no one locked it. Bare and simple, it held benches, a fence, and frozen ground. Slowly, it became familiar. I paused near the door longer than I needed to. Because my coat felt too thin, I zipped it higher. Automatic and distracted, my fingers fumbled with the zipper. Quietly, I noticed how slow my hands felt. At the far end of the path, a wooden bench sat near the fence line. Because snow piled up there first, it often looked abandoned. Plain and steady, it gave me a place to sit without expectation. Slowly, I brushed snow away with my sleeve. Before sitting, I checked my phone. Because I always checked it, the motion felt empty. Dim and unimportant, the screen showed the time wrong by a few minutes. Quietly, I told myself the battery was acting up again. At the time, sitting felt harmless. Because my feet ached from hours of standing, rest felt earned. Practical and calm, I leaned back and watched my breath fog. Slowly, my shoulders dropped. I had been tired for a long time by then. Although sleep filled my hours off, it never felt finished. Thin and shallow, rest slipped away too fast. Quietly, I stopped trusting it. Earlier that week, one of the residents had asked my name twice in the same minute. Because I answered gently both times, she smiled like it was the first. Soft and misplaced, that smile stayed with me longer than it should have. Slowly, I wondered how many times I repeated myself without noticing. Weeks before that, my sister had called late. Although I recognized her number, I let it ring. Avoidant and tired, I watched the screen go dark. Quietly, that became another habit. In the garden, none of that mattered at first. Although problems followed me everywhere else, they felt quieter here. Muted and dull, thoughts stayed loose. Quietly, the bench held me without asking why. Snow fell in slow, even layers. Because there was no wind, it landed straight down. Soft and steady, the sound filled the gaps in my head. Slowly, minutes blurred. From inside the building, no noise reached me. Although people slept just yards away, the distance felt wider. Safe and sealed, the walls kept the world contained. Quietly, I forgot about time again. I shifted my weight and felt the bench press back. Because the wood was cold, I expected discomfort. Solid and present, it grounded me instead. Slowly, that comfort faded. That was when the heaviness returned. Although it didn't arrive suddenly, it spread fast. Low and dragging, it pulled at my arms and legs. Slowly, sitting felt heavier than standing had. At the time, it felt normal. Because night shifts always drained me, I didn't question it. Dismissive and tired, I stayed where I was. Quietly, the snow kept falling. I rolled my shoulders once, then again. Because movement usually helped, I waited for relief. Delayed and weak, it never came. Slowly, my posture folded inward. Beyond the fence, trees stood packed close together. Because snow weighed their branches down, they barely moved. Dark and layered, they blended into one shape. Quietly, my eyes kept returning there. I tried to count the trunks like I usually did. Because it helped pass time, I focused hard. Uneven and frustrating, the numbers slipped away. Slowly, I stopped trying. Inside my chest, the heaviness deepened. Although I took a slow breath, it didn't ease. Unbalanced and thick, it made movement feel optional. Slowly, a thought formed. Go back inside. I didn't think much of it. Because stepping inside was always an option, the idea felt calm, unhurried and gentle. It didn't feel urgent. Quietly, I ignored it. Snow gathered on my sleeves. Because I didn't brush it away, it piled higher, light and constant. The cold softened. Slowly, sensation dulled. The garden felt quieter than before. Although nothing obvious had changed, the stillness felt deeper. Dense and closed, the space seemed to hold itself. Quietly, I noticed my breathing slow. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Because standing felt like effort, I stayed seated. Passive and loose, my posture softened. Slowly, the bench creaked beneath me. From the far side of the fence, depth shifted. Although I didn't see movement, space rearranged itself. Subtle and wrong, something stood out where nothing had before. Quietly, my breath shortened. I told myself it was just the snow. Because snowfall always played tricks, the explanation felt ready. Logical and thin, it didn't hold long. Slowly, doubt settled in. I squinted into the trees. Because snow blurred edges, I searched for reason. Focused and uneasy, I waited for clarity. Quietly, none came. The heaviness spread into my shoulders. Because lifting my arms felt tiring, I let them rest. Drained and compliant, my body settled deeper. Quietly, the thought returned again. Stay. I didn't argue with it. Because it felt easier not to, I remained seated. Calm and distant, concern softened. Slowly, the snow filled my vision. The bench creaked again beneath my weight. Although I hadn't shifted, the sound lingered. Patient and strained, it suggested settling. Quietly, my posture followed. Beyond the fence, space felt fuller. Because distance stopped behaving, the gap thinned. Close and complete, it pressed inward. Slowly, my breath matched it. Inside my head, thoughts loosened. Because holding on to them felt tiring, I let them drift. Unordered and faint, they passed without shape. Quietly, focus thinned. From the trees, darkness leaned closer. Although nothing crossed over, separation faded. Flat and near, it filled the garden. Slowly, the idea returned. Rest. My eyes closed without resistance. Because keeping them open felt pointless, I didn't try. Calm and distant, awareness thinned. Quietly, the snow became everything. Just before sleep fully took me, the space beyond the fence felt close enough to lean in. Behind my closed eyes, the light from the building dimmed further. Although I hadn't moved, it felt farther away. Weak and distant, it stopped pulling at me. Slowly, the garden became the only place that felt real. Near the fence, snow gathered in smooth, untouched lines. Because no one walked there, the surface stayed perfect. Too even and careful, it felt arranged. Quietly, I avoided looking too long. I became aware of how warm my back felt. Although the bench was cold, the warmth stayed. Gentle and spreading, it dulled urgency. Slowly, my shoulders relaxed further. From inside the building, a cart rolled faintly down a hallway. Because the sound was familiar, it should have grounded me. Stretched and thin, it barely reached me. Quietly, it slipped away. I pressed my heels into the snow again. Because grounding myself mattered, I focused on pressure. Soft and forgiving, the ground gave way. Slowly, even that anchor failed. A memory returned without warning. Although it didn't belong here, it felt close. Blurry and unfinished, it was of waiting beside my father's bed late at night. Quietly, the same stillness wrapped around me. Back then, machines hummed in the same low rhythm. Because waiting felt safer than acting, I stayed still. Long and quiet, the hours passed unnoticed. Slowly, that memory settled into my chest. In the garden, waiting felt the same. Although nothing demanded it, stillness felt right. Gentle and firm, the pull stayed. Quietly, I stopped questioning it. Snow brushed my collar and melted. Because I didn't react, it soaked the fabric. cold and distant, the feeling barely registered. Slowly, sensation thinned further. I noticed my hands resting flat on my legs. Because lifting them felt tiring, I didn't try. Warm and distant, they barely felt like mine. Quietly, my posture stayed open. The fence posts looked taller than before. Although they hadn't changed, the space felt compressed. Leaning and watchful, they closed in. Slowly, my gaze dropped. Inside my chest, the heaviness shifted lower. Because it spread instead of lifted, I stopped resisting. Thick and slow, it settled into my stomach and legs. Quietly, movement felt optional. I thought about standing one last time. Because deciding usually helped, I tried to focus. Loose and unfocused, the thought drifted away. Slowly, choice softened. The bench creaked again, longer than before. Although I hadn't moved, the sound came anyway. Patient and strained, it suggested weight settling. Quietly, my body followed. From the trees, nothing stepped forward. Although I expected sound, none came. Full and waiting, the stillness held. Slowly, pressure increased. I blinked slowly, eyelids heavy. Because keeping them open took effort, I didn't force it. Calm and distant, focus faded. Quietly, the world narrowed. The air near my face felt thicker. Although nothing touched me, it felt crowded. Close and full space pressed inward. Slowly, my breathing matched it. I noticed then how little I wanted to move. Because nothing held me, leaving still felt wrong. Gentle and firm, the thought stayed. Quietly, the night agreed. Snow continued falling at the same pace. Because it erased edges, the garden blurred. Even and endless, it filled everything. Slowly, time lost shape. From beyond the fence, the darkness felt complete. Although nothing crossed over, separation vanished. Present and whole, it filled the space. Quietly, awareness thinned further. I sat there, breathing shallow and slow, and the garden no longer felt like a place I could leave. Above the garden, the sky flattened into a single pale surface. Although snow still fell, it felt suspended, muted and distant. Everything slowed at once. Slowly, the night stopped feeling open. From the bench, the wood pressed into the backs of my legs. Because sensation had dulled, the pressure barely registered. Heavy and constant, it held me in place. Quietly, my body accepted it. Beyond the fence, the space felt fuller than before. Although nothing crossed into the garden, the gap thinned. Close and complete, it pressed inward without moving. Slowly, my breath matched its pace. Inside my head, thoughts loosened and slid apart. Because holding onto them felt tiring, I let them drift. Unordered and faint, they passed without shape. Quietly, focus thinned. Near my boots, snow piled higher. Although it should have felt cold, it didn't. Numb and distant, my feet stayed where they were. Slowly, the bench became an anchor. From the trees, darkness leaned forward. Because depth no longer made sense, distance collapsed. Flat and close, the background pressed in. Quietly, the presence felt nearer than the fence allowed. I tried to remember why I had stepped outside. Because the reason felt small, it slipped away. Unimportant and dull, it failed to hold. Slowly, the garden took its place. The air thickened around my face. Although nothing touched me, it felt crowded. Full and close, space pressed inward. Quietly, my chest rose and fell with effort. From the presence, attention settled like weight. Because it carried no sound, it felt heavier. Directed and patient, it stayed fixed on me. Slowly, the heaviness in my body deepened. Snow slid from a branch beyond the fence. Although the sound was soft, it echoed. Delayed and hollow, it marked time passing. Quietly, I stopped counting moments. The bench creaked beneath my weight. Because I hadn't shifted, the sound felt wrong. Subtle and strained, it suggested pressure. Slowly, my posture softened further. Inside my chest, warmth spread. Although the night was cold, it felt comforting. False and gentle, it replaced urgency. Quietly, fear faded into the background. From the trees, the presence leaned closer. Although it never crossed the fence, the gap vanished. Present and complete, it filled the garden. Slowly, the thought returned for the last time. Rest. My eyes closed without resistance. Because keeping them open felt pointless, I didn't try. Calm and distant, awareness thinned. Quietly, the snow became everything. Just before sleep fully took me, the space beyond the fence felt close enough to lean in. Against the bench, my weight felt settled in a way it hadn't before. Although I'd tried to shift it, nothing answered. Heavy and exact. Stillness held. Slowly, the garden breathed around me. Behind my closed eyes, light thinned. Because the security lamp hummed on, I expected glow. Weak and distant, it failed to reach. Quietly, darkness pressed closer. Near my ears, sound softened further. Although snow kept falling, it barely landed. Padded and dull, the night absorbed it. Slowly, silence gained shape. Inside my chest, breath slowed on its own. Because I wasn't counting anymore, it drifted. Loose and shallow, it followed a rhythm I hadn't chosen. Quietly, my body listened. From the fence, pressure remained steady. Although nothing touched me, it felt present. Patient and complete, it waited without urgency. Slowly, the urge to move faded again. I tried to open my eyes. Because I knew they were closed, I focused. Late and uncertain, the effort stopped halfway. Quietly, lids stayed shut. Under my gloves, fingers tingled faintly. Although sensation returned for a moment, it didn't last. Thin and fleeting, it slipped away. Slowly, my hands felt placed rather than owned. The bench creaked once, low and long. Because I hadn't shifted, the sound felt wrong. Measured and deliberate, it marked weight settling deeper. Quietly, I sank into it. Beyond the fence, space rearranged itself again. Although no movement followed, distance collapsed. Near and unbroken, it filled everything. Slowly, the idea of edges disappeared. I thought about calling out. Because sound felt possible, the thought formed. Small and weak, it dissolved before shape. Quietly, my throat stayed still. Inside my head, memories loosened. Because holding them took effort, they drifted. Unordered and dim, they brushed past. Slowly, one stayed. I remembered standing beside that resident's bed. Although she smiled, her eyes had searched. Uncertain and soft, they hadn't found me. Quietly, that look returned now. Back then, I'd stayed quiet. Because words felt unnecessary, I waited. Careful and slow, I let the moment pass. Slowly, that choice echoed. The air near my face warmed again. Although the night was cold, comfort spread. False and gentle, it dulled concern. Quietly, fear thinned further. From the presence, the tension remained fixed. Although it never rushed, it didn't leave. Steady and exact, it stayed aligned with me. Slowly, my breathing matched it fully. I felt the bench against my back differently. Because pressure shifted, it felt closer. Firm and supportive, it held me upright. Quietly, I stopped fighting it. Snow touched my cheeks and melted. Although I noticed it briefly, the feeling faded. Light and forgettable, it left no mark. Slowly, sensation stayed shallow. Inside my legs, warmth deepened. Because it spread instead of lifted, I accepted it. Soft and heavy, it anchored me. Quietly, movement felt unnecessary. From the building behind me, no sound came. Although people slept inside, it felt far away. Muted and unreal, it no longer belonged. Slowly, the garden became everything again. I thought about standing once more. Because I knew I should, the idea surfaced. Incomplete and thin, it drifted off. Quietly, choice softened. Beyond the fence, the presence felt closer still. Although it never crossed, separation vanished. Whole and immediate, it filled the space where distance used to be. Slowly, my awareness narrowed. I rested fully against the bench. Because holding myself up felt pointless, I let go. Calm and distant, my posture folded. Quietly, the night held me. Against my ribs, breath slowed even more. Although I waited for it to catch, it didn't. Measured and calm, it stayed shallow. Slowly, my chest followed along. From the bench, pressure shifted again. Because I hadn't moved, the change felt chosen. Supportive and exact, the wood adjusted to me. Quietly, my spine settled. Behind the fence, the trees felt nearer without sound. Although no branch moved, space tightened. Dense and close, it pressed inward. Slowly, the garden lost depth. I listened for my name. Because habit expected it, I stayed alert. Empty and flat, nothing came. Quietly, that felt right. Inside my mouth, dryness spread. Although I swallowed, it didn't help. Thick and slow, the feeling stayed. Slowly, I stopped trying. A thought surfaced, soft and incomplete. Because it lacked words, it felt safer. Vague and heavy, it lingered. Quietly, I let it remain. I remembered the first night I worked alone. Although the halls were full, they felt hollow. Bright and distant. The lights never warned me. Slowly, that same hollow returned. Back then, sitting had helped, because standing made time louder, rest felt better. Still and quiet, it softened everything. Quietly, the lesson stayed. Near my knees, warmth spread further. Although snow kept falling, I barely noticed. Comforting and wrong, it dulled edges. Slowly, urgency faded again. From the presence, patience never wavered, because it didn't push. Resistance felt unnecessary. Certain and steady, it waited. Quietly, I matched it. I tried to move my toes. Because small motions usually worked, I focused, delayed and faint. Nothing answered. Slowly, I stopped asking. Above the garden, the light thinned further. Although the lamp stayed on, it felt tired. Pale and weak, it lost reach. Quietly, shadows filled the gaps. Inside my head, counting failed again. Because numbers slipped, time dissolved. Loose and unmarked, moments blended. Slowly, I stopped measuring. The bench no longer felt cold. Although it should have, warmth stayed. Borrowed and steady, it held me. Quietly, I accepted it. From behind me, the building felt distant. Because no sound carried, it faded. Muted and unreal, it slipped away. Slowly, the garden claimed all of me. Against my temples, a dull warmth settled. Although I waited for sharpness, none came. Soft and spreading, the feeling stayed. Slowly, thought lost edges. From the fence, the pressure felt closer again. Because distance no longer behaved, it pressed without touch. Near and certain, it occupied the space between moments. Quietly, my breathing followed it. I tried to picture the door behind me, because I'd walked through it countless times. The image should have formed. Thin and broken, it fell apart halfway. Slowly, the idea of inside faded. Inside my ears, a low hum appeared. Although nothing sounded, the vibration felt real. Even unsteady, it replaced silence. Quietly, my head leaned into it. I remembered signing my name at the start of shifts. Although the pen always worked, my hand sometimes shook. Small and telling, that shake stayed unnoticed. Slowly, the memory drifted past. Back then, I blamed the coffee, because it was easier. The reason fit. Simple and neat, it closed the thought. Quietly, I moved on. Near my shoulders, the air felt thicker. Although nothing touched me, space pressed inward. Crowded and full, it held me. Slowly, posture softened again. From the presence, attention never wavered. Because it didn't need sound, it felt heavier. Exact and patient, it stayed aligned. Quietly, I stopped resisting. I tried to lift my chin. Because the movement was small, it should have worked. Late and weak, it stalled. Slowly, my head stayed lowered. Snow brushed my lashes and melted. Although I noticed it, the sensation passed. Brief and forgettable, it left nothing behind. Quietly, awareness thinned further. Inside my chest, the rhythm steadied. Because panic never arrived, calm felt wrong. Muted and controlled, it stayed. Slowly, fear softened into something else. I thought about the residents sleeping inside. Because I usually checked on them, the habit stirred. Faint and distant, the urge faded. Quietly, responsibility loosened. From the bench, support felt deliberate. Because it held my weight so well, it felt chosen. Firm and steady, it kept me upright. Slowly, I leaned into it. The garden no longer felt open. Although the sky remained above, it pressed down, low and close, it closed the space. Quietly, the night narrowed. I waited for a sound that never came. Because waiting felt natural, I stayed. Patient and still, I matched the quiet. Slowly, the moment stretched. Inside my mouth, breath tasted flat. Although I swallowed again, nothing changed. Dry and distant, sensation dulled. Quietly, effort stopped. I remembered the first winter after my father passed. Although days moved on, nights stayed long. Cold and empty, sitting felt easier than standing. Slowly, that habit returned. Back then, stillness had helped me cope. Because movement brought thoughts, rest felt safer. Learned and deep, the choice stuck. Quietly, my body remembered. From beyond the fence, the presence felt complete. Although it never stepped closer, it filled everything. Whole and settled, it stayed. Slowly, separation vanished. Against the sides of my neck, warmth gathered and stayed. Although the air should have felt cold, it didn't. Soft and enclosing, it shaped the space around my head. Slowly, the night felt closer than skin. From behind the fence, nothing moved at all. Because stillness had finished changing, it felt complete. Balanced and quiet, it held its place. Quietly, my breath settled into it. I tried to lift my shoulders once. Because the motion was small, it should have worked. Late and faint, the effort faded. Slowly, my body stayed where it was. Inside my thoughts, a memory loosened and surfaced. Although it came without detail, it carried weight. Old and familiar, it felt like sitting in waiting rooms after midnight. Quietly, that calm returned. Back then, waiting had felt safer than answers, because answers meant endings. Stillness felt kind, learned and deep. The habit stayed. Slowly, my body followed it again. Near my knees, the bench felt wider. Although wood shouldn't change shape, it did. Supportive and exact, it held me comfortably. Quietly, I leaned into it. From the presence beyond the fence, patience remained unchanged, because it never pressed. It felt final, certain and complete. It stayed aligned with me. Slowly, resistance slipped away. Snow continued falling without sound. Although flakes touched my coat, they vanished on contact. Light and forgettable, they left no trace. Quietly, time blurred again. Inside my chest, breath stayed shallow and slow. Because panic never came, calm felt wrong. Muted and steady, it replaced urgency. Slowly, fear softened into distance. I noticed how little effort everything took now. Because nothing demanded movement, stillness felt right. Easy and calm, the moment held itself. Quietly, my body agreed. Against the bench, the warmth no longer felt borrowed. Although I knew it shouldn't belong there, it stayed. Even and settled, it felt earned. Slowly, the idea of cold disappeared. From beyond the fence, the presence did not move closer, because it didn't need to. It felt complete. Whole and patient, it filled the garden without effort. Quietly, distance stopped, meaning anything. Inside my chest, breath slowed until it barely felt like breath. Although I waited for discomfort, none came. Soft and shallow, the rhythm held. Slowly, my body followed it without question. I became aware of how long I had been sitting. Because time no longer lined up, the thought felt thin. Unclear and dull, it failed to settle. Quietly, the question drifted away. From the building behind me, nothing called out. Although doors and lights still existed, they felt imagined. Flat and unreal, they lost weight. Slowly, the garden remained the only thing that felt true. Near my hands, the bench felt shaped to me now. Because it supported every part evenly, it felt intentional. Firm and exact, it held me upright. Quietly, I stopped thinking of it as a place to sit. Snow continued to fall without sound. Although it touched my coat and skin, it left no trace. Light and forgettable, it vanished instantly. Slowly, change stopped registering. Inside my head, one last thought formed. Because it came without fear, it felt safe. Simple and calm, it settled easily. Slowly it stayed. I didn't need to stand. Because nothing waited inside, there was no reason. Clear and certain, the idea felt complete. Quietly, resistance ended. From the presence, attention rested fully on me. Although it never touched, it felt close enough. Steady and final, it stayed. Slowly, my awareness narrowed to that alone. The bench no longer creaked beneath my weight. Because nothing shifted anymore, it felt finished. Still and balanced, everything held. Quietly, my body accepted the stillness. I rested there, breathing shallow and even, and the waiting stopped being something that would end. Against my lower back, the bench felt wider than before. Although wood shouldn't adjust, it seemed to. Supportive and exact, it carried me evenly. Slowly, the idea of discomfort disappeared. From the fence line, the space stayed full without movement. Because nothing needed to cross, it felt settled. Complete and quiet, it held its shape. Quietly, distance stopped asking to be measured. Inside my chest, warmth spread without urgency. Although the night stayed cold, it didn't reach me. Soft and constant, the feeling remained. Slowly, contrast lost meaning. I tried to remember the time again, because checking it used to ground me. The habit surfaced, thin and blank. The thought slipped away. Quietly, minutes stopped forming. Near my elbows, pressure held steady. Although I shifted my weight slightly, nothing changed. Balanced and patient, the bench stayed firm. Slowly, movement felt unnecessary. From behind me, the building stayed silent. Because no sound carried, it felt distant. Muted and unreal, it lost presence. Quietly, the garden remained complete. Inside my head, thoughts drifted without order. Because holding them felt tiring, I didn't try. Loose and unmarked, they passed. Slowly, focus thinned further. Snow brushed my sleeve and vanished. Although I noticed the touch, it faded quickly. Light and forgettable, it left nothing behind. Quietly, sensation stayed shallow. From the presence beyond the fence, attention never shifted. Because it didn't hurry, it felt final. Certain and complete, it stayed aligned. Slowly, resistance ended again. I rested there, breathing shallow and even, and the stillness felt permanent rather than paused. Against my shoulders, the air stayed close and steady. Although nothing touched me, it felt arranged. Near and exact, it held the space in place. Slowly, the sense of leaning disappeared. From the bench, support remained unchanged. Because it no longer shifted, it felt decided. Firm and even, it carried me without sound. Quietly, my body stopped testing it. Inside my ears, quiet deepened again. Although snow continued to fall, it barely reached me. Soft and distant, sound lost weight. Slowly, silence became familiar. I thought about standing one last time. Because the idea had returned before, I waited for it to grow. Small and incomplete, it faded. Quietly, the choice dissolved. Near my hands, warmth lingered. Although my gloves should have felt cold, they didn't. Dull and constant sensation stayed shallow. Slowly, contrast vanished. From beyond the fence, the presence remained whole. Because it never needed to move, it felt final. Complete and patient, it filled the garden. Quietly, separation stopped mattering. Inside my chest, breath stayed shallow and even. Although I wasn't guiding it, it didn't change. Soft and steady, the rhythm held. Slowly, effort ended. I rested there without shifting, and the stillness no longer suggested an end. Story number 5. In the narrow kitchen of the lakeside house, the clock blinked 2017 in soft red numbers. The kind that never feel fully awake, although the rest of the place was asleep. The room carried a low tension, like air before a storm that never comes. Half dressed in an old sweater, Daniel stood barefoot on the cold tile, holding a glass of water he had already forgotten to drink. Quietly, the refrigerator hummed behind him, filling the silence just enough to make the quiet feel heavier instead of empty. Against the dark window above the sink, rain traced thin lines downward, slow and uneven, while the lake beyond stayed hidden in darkness. The sound of water against the glass felt closer than it should have. Tired but unable to lie down, Daniel leaned his forehead against the cabinet door and exhaled through his nose. Slowly, he rubbed his eyes, telling himself this restlessness was normal for someone who worked nights alone. In the months since he'd taken the caretaker role, sleep had become a loose habit instead of a routine. Because the property only needed someone present after midnight, his days felt flipped and unfinished. Used to quiet record keeping and long hours of watching nothing happen, Daniel had learned how to sit with boredom. Calmly, he reminded himself that tonight was no different from the others. Near the back hallway, a small lamp stayed on, casting a weak yellow circle on the floorboards. Although the house was old, its sounds were familiar by now. Each creak, a known voice, unshaken by the gentle settling of wood. Daniel walked past the hallway and checked the back door lock again. Patiently, he twisted the handle, feeling the solid resistance push back. Beneath the low ceiling of the sitting room, the air felt warmer but heavier. While rain tapped the roof in uneven rhythms, the walls seemed to listen instead of echo. Sitting down on the couch, Daniel stretched his legs and stared at the dark fireplace. Briefly, he thought about turning on the television, then decided against it. In the corner by the stairs, a box of old notebooks sat untouched. Because the owner liked written logs more than digital ones, Daniel kept careful notes about small things. Methodically, he opened the top notebook and flipped through blank pages, the paper whispering softly. Slowly, he set the book aside without writing anything. Across the room, the large front window faced the lake, though nothing could be seen at night. Although the glass reflected only the room behind him, Daniel felt the pull of it anyway, uneasy without knowing why. He stood and walked closer, stopping just short of the glass. Softly, rain slid down the window like fingers testing a surface. In his chest, a tight feeling formed, faint but steady. While his mind searched for a reason, his body reacted first, shoulders lifting slightly. Frozen in place, Daniel listened for something that wasn't there. Quietly, his breath slowed as he waited. Beyond the window, the lake stayed silent. Because the rain muffled distance, every sound felt near and far at the same time. Restless again, Daniel checked his watch and frowned at how little time had passed. Slowly, he turned away, annoyed at himself for staring. Along the hallway toward the guest rooms, the floor creaked once. Although it was a sound he'd heard before, it landed differently this time. Stiff-backed, Daniel stopped walking and held his breath. Carefully, he waited for the sound to repeat. Nothing followed. While the house settled back into stillness, his pulse stayed elevated. Embarrassed by the tension, Daniel shook his head and forced a small laugh. Quietly, he muttered that he needed real sleep. Near the bottom stair, a framed photo leaned crooked on the wall. Because he hadn't straightened it since arriving weeks ago, it caught his eye now. Distracted by the tilt, Daniel reached out and adjusted the frame. Slowly, his fingers brushed cold glass. Behind him, a soft sound passed through the air. Although it wasn't loud, it carried weight. Stunned by the sudden awareness, Daniel turned halfway. Carefully, he scanned the empty sitting room. At the far end, near the back door, the lamp flickered once. While the light steadied again, his stomach tightened. Uneasy but trying to stay calm, Daniel walked toward it. Softly, the floor whispered under his steps. In the narrow space by the door, the smell of damp wood felt stronger. Because the rain had picked up, moisture crept in around the frame. Leaning down, Daniel checked the weather seal with his fingertips. Briefly, he wondered if the house always smelled this way. Outside the door, rain struck harder. While he focused on the sound, something else pressed at the edge of his hearing. Distracted, Daniel straightened and listened. Slowly, his hand lowered from the handle. From somewhere deeper in the house, a faint shift occurred. Although it might have been the upstairs settling, it didn't fade like usual. Tense now, Daniel stayed still, eyes fixed on the hallway. Quietly, he counted his breaths. At the top of the stairs, darkness pooled thickly. Because the lamp below didn't reach far, the upper landing disappeared into shadow. Reluctant to move, but unwilling to ignore it, Daniel placed one foot on the first step. Carefully, the stair creaked beneath his weight. In the silence that followed, the house felt alert. While nothing changed visually, the space felt occupied. Pausing mid-step, Daniel swallowed and listened again. Softly, rain filled the gaps between moments. Behind him, the lamp dimmed slightly. Although it returned to normal, the shift stayed with him. Anxious now, Daniel continued up the stairs one step at a time. Slowly, his hand traced the banister for balance. Halfway up, the air cooled. Because heat rose unevenly in the old place, the difference felt wrong. Goosebumps spread along his arms as he stopped again. Quietly, he told himself to finish the check and go back down. At the landing, the hallway stretched in two directions. While the guest room stayed dark and still, the door to the storage room stood ajar. Focused on that small detail, Daniel stared at the narrow gap. Carefully, he approached without turning on a light. Inside the storage room, shadows layered over stacked boxes. Although he remembered closing the door earlier, he questioned that memory now, uneasy. Daniel pushed the door open another inch. Slowly, the hinges breathed out a faint sound. In the dimness, nothing moved. Because his eyes strained for detail, the room felt deeper than it was. Holding his breath, Daniel scanned the shelves and corners. Quietly, he stepped inside. Behind him, the hallway stayed silent. While the rain continued outside, the house felt removed from it now. Nervous but determined, Daniel reached for the pull-cord light. Slowly, he tugged. The bulb overhead flickered to life. Although the room revealed nothing unusual, relief didn't come. Rigid with attention, Daniel noticed faint marks on the floor near the shelves. Carefully, he crouched to look closer. On the dusty boards, shallow impressions crossed the space. Because they were partial and uneven, they looked unfinished. Uncertain what to think, Daniel traced one with his eyes. Quietly, his chest tightened again. Behind him, somewhere downstairs, the lamp clicked off. Beneath the thin ceiling above the storage room, the sudden absence of light downstairs felt loud. Although nothing else changed, the house seemed to pull inward, as if listening to itself. Stiff-backed, Daniel stayed crouched, counting the space between breaths. Quietly, dust settled around his shoes. Across the floor, the shallow marks caught what little light there was. While they didn't look deep enough to be footprints, they followed a path. Uneasy but curious, Daniel stood and followed them with his eyes toward the far wall. Slowly, his hand tightened around the light cord. Near the back corner, a box lid sat half open. Because he remembered sealing everything earlier in the evening, the detail bothered him. Carefully, Daniel stepped closer, keeping his movements measured. Softly, cardboard shifted under his fingers. Inside the box, nothing stood out. Although it held only old blankets and folded tarps, the smell felt stale and close. Distracted by that scent, Daniel straightened and rubbed his nose. Quietly, he told himself it was just damp fabric. From below, a new sound drifted up. While it wasn't sharp, it carried intention. Frozen in place, Daniel angled his head toward the stairwell. Slowly, his breathing flattened. At the base of the stairs, something moved. Because the light there was off, the sound felt blind. Unsteady but controlled, Daniel stepped back toward the doorway. Carefully, the floor creaked under his heel. The noise below stopped. Although silence returned, it didn't loosen the tightness in his shoulders. Anxious now, Daniel stayed still, listening past the sound of rain. Quietly, his jaw clenched. In the hallway outside the storage room, the darkness felt thicker than before. While the landing had never been bright, it now seemed to absorb light. Reluctant to move but unable to wait, Daniel eased into the hall. Slowly, he pulled the door closed behind him. Down the stairs, the sitting room stayed dim. Because the lamp remained off, the room shape blurred at the edges. Careful not to rush, Daniel descended one step at a time. Softly, each stair spoke beneath him. Halfway down, the smell of the house changed. Although faint, it reminded him of wet leaves and cold soil. Distracted by the thought, Daniel paused again. Quietly, he swallowed. At the bottom, the sitting room waited. While furniture shapes sat where they should, the space felt rearranged. Tense and alert, Daniel scanned the corners before stepping off the last stair. Slowly, his eyes adjusted. Against the far wall, the lamp stood dark and still. Because he clearly remembered leaving it on, that detail pulled at him. Uneasy, Daniel crossed the room and reached for the switch. Carefully, he clicked it back on. The light returned without flicker. Although the familiar glow should have helped, it didn't. Rigid with attention, Daniel noticed The air felt cooler near the window. Quietly, he turned toward it. On the glass, thin trails of moisture had shifted. While rain still fell outside, these marks sat on the inside surface. Confused, Daniel stepped closer and leaned in. Slowly, his reflection blurred with the dark beyond. In the corner of the window, a faint shape lingered. Because it wasn't clear, his mind struggled to name it. Still in focus, Daniel raised his hand toward the glass. Carefully, he stopped inches away. The shape matched the curve of a palm. Although shallow and incomplete, it felt intentional. Unsettled, Daniel lowered his hand and stepped back, quietly. His pulse thudded once, hard. Behind him, the kitchen clock ticked louder than before. While it had always been audible, the sound now filled the room. Distracted and tense, Daniel glanced toward the kitchen doorway. Slowly, he counted the seconds. In that pause, another sound joined the ticking. Because it came from outside, it carried a damp softness. Frozen again, Daniel listened harder. Quietly, rain parted around something moving. Beyond the window, the lake stayed dark. Although the rain blurred the surface, ripples spread unevenly. Uneasy with the pattern, Daniel watched without blinking. Slowly, his shoulders rose. Along the shoreline, something disturbed the water. While it didn't break the surface, it moved with purpose. Stiff and uncertain, Daniel stepped back from the glass. Carefully, he reached for his phone. The screen lit the room briefly. Although there were no alerts, the light felt exposed. Anxious now, Daniel dimmed it again and slipped it into his pocket. Quietly, he wished for morning without fully admitting it. Near the back door, the air felt colder. Because rain had soaked the porch, damp crept under the frame. Hesitant, Daniel walked that direction anyway. Slowly, his hand hovered near the lock. Outside, something shifted. While he couldn't see it, the movement felt close. Tense and alert, Daniel leaned toward the door without opening it. Carefully, he listened. A soft scrape followed. Although it sounded like wet fabric against wood, it paused too deliberately, unsteady. Daniel pulled his hand back from the handle. Quietly, he stepped away. In the center of the sitting room, the space felt narrower. Because the lamp's light didn't reach the corners, shadows stayed thick. Distracted by movement that wasn't there, Daniel turned slowly in place. Softly, his breath fogged. Behind the couch, a faint sound rose and stopped. While it might have been the house settling, it didn't finish. Rigid now, Daniel faced that direction. Carefully, he waited. Nothing appeared. Although the silence returned, it felt deliberate. Uneasy and tired, Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. Quietly, he wondered how long the night had left. Near the stairs, the air stirred again. Because it carried a faint warmth, it felt wrong. Stiff-backed, Daniel took one cautious step toward it. Slowly, his foot met the rug. From above, a soft pressure passed through the ceiling. While it wasn't a sound, it felt like weight shifting. Frozen mid-step, Daniel looked up. Quietly, his heart hammered. In the stillness that followed, the house seemed to breathe. Although he couldn't explain it, the sensation settled deep. Uncertain and worn, Daniel lowered his gaze. Slowly, he backed away from the stairs. Near the kitchen, the clock blinked again. Because the time hadn't changed much, dread crept in. Distracted and drained, Daniel leaned against the counter. Quietly, he closed his eyes. Behind his lids, the house stayed present. While he stood there, the sense of being watched did not fade. Tense and exhausted, Daniel opened his eyes again. Slowly, he realized the night was not moving forward. In the quiet space between ticks of the clock, the house felt suspended. Although nothing new announced itself, the stillness pressed closer than before. Worn down by listening, Daniel pushed himself upright from the counter. Slowly, his joints protested, as if he had been standing there much longer than he thought. Along the edge of the kitchen, the floor felt colder under his feet. Because the heat hadn't changed, the chill seemed personal somehow. Distracted by the sensation, Daniel shuffled toward the sitting room again. Quietly, he avoided looking at the window. Near the couch, the shadows stretched unevenly. While the lamp still glowed, its light bent around something unseen. Uneasy but curious, Daniel paused and leaned forward slightly. Carefully, He watched the space behind the furniture. From that dark pocket, nothing emerged. Although his eyes strained for detail, the shape stayed empty. Embarrassed by the fear creeping in, Daniel exhaled slowly. Quietly, he reminded himself he was alone. At the back door, the rain eased. Because the sound softened, the silence outside grew clearer. Tense again, Daniel turned his head toward the door. Slowly, he noticed a faint shadow at the base. Against the threshold, something blocked the thin line of porch light. Although it didn't move, it felt intentional. Frozen, Daniel stared without stepping closer. Quietly, his fingers curled into his palms. Behind the door, a soft pressure settled. While it wasn't enough to move the handle, it lingered. Rigid with attention, Daniel held his breath. Slowly, seconds dragged without release. From upstairs, the sound of a floorboard bending carried down. Because it came from the landing he just left, it felt wrong. Uneasy and alert, Daniel turned away from the door. Carefully, he backed toward the center of the room. In the glow of the lamp, the room looked smaller. Although nothing had changed, the walls felt closer. Tired and shaken, Daniel lowered himself onto the couch. Quietly, the cushions sighed under his weight. Above him, the ceiling creaked once. While houses often settled, this sound did not finish. Still and listening, Daniel tilted his head. Slowly, his chest tightened again. From directly overhead, a faint drag passed across the ceiling. Although light, it carried direction. Frozen on the couch, Daniel did not move. Quietly, his breath slowed until it almost stopped. The drag paused. Because it hovered in place, anticipation filled the room. Uneasy beyond reason, Daniel closed his eyes. Slowly, he counted his heartbeat. In that pause, something pressed downward. While it never broke through, the ceiling bowed just slightly. Stunned, Daniel opened his eyes. Quietly, he watched dust shake loose. Across the room, the lamp flickered. Although it stayed on, the moment felt like a warning. Tense and shaking, Daniel stood again. Slowly, he backed toward the kitchen. Behind him, the pressure above shifted. Because it followed, panic stirred low and heavy. Unsteady now, Daniel reached the counter and gripped its edge. Quietly, he fought the urge to run. Near the stairs, the air thickened. While nothing showed itself, the space felt occupied. Cornered by feeling alone, Daniel glanced around wildly. Slowly, he realized the house was guiding him nowhere. Above the stairs, a shadow deepened. Because the light refused to touch it, the shape held. Rigid and trapped, Daniel stared upward. Quietly, he accepted that something was waiting. In the silence that followed, the house stopped breathing. Although rain still fell outside, it sounded distant now. Drained and uncertain, Daniel lowered his head. Slowly, he understood he was no longer being watched. He was being held. Against the steady pressure of the ceiling, Daniel stayed where he was. Hands braced against the counter. Although his legs wanted to give out, the floor felt like the only solid thing left. Drained and quiet, he listened for any change in the house. Slowly, the sense of being held did not lift. In the kitchen light, the room looked ordinary again, because nothing had shifted in place. Doubt crept in beside the fear. Carefully, Daniel straightened and tested his weight on both feet. Quietly, his breath shook as he exhaled. Along the wall, the cabinet stood closed and still. While the clock continued its soft blinking, time felt stalled. Tired beyond panic, Daniel rested his forehead against the cool surface. Slowly, he tried to remember what the house felt like earlier. In that memory, things had weight, but not intention. Because the difference mattered, his chest tightened again. Uncertain and worn thin, Daniel pushed away from the counter. Quietly, he decided he needed to move. Across the sitting room, the couch waited where he left it. Although it offered rest, the space above it felt wrong now. Careful not to look up, Daniel crossed the room again. Slowly, he picked up his jacket from the chair. Near the front door, the air felt lighter. Because it faced the lake, sound moved differently there. Hesitant but focused, Daniel stepped closer to the door. Quietly, he placed his hand on the lock. Outside, rain had slowed to a fine mist. While the porch light cast a weak glow, it did not reach far. Tense and listening, Daniel leaned his ear closer to the wood. Slowly, he waited. Nothing pressed back this time. Although relief flickered, it did not settle. Carefully, Daniel turned the lock until it clicked. Quietly, he opened the door a few inches. On the porch, damp oars reflected the light. Because the lake stayed hidden, the darkness felt deeper. Unsteady but needing space, Daniel stepped outside. Slowly, the cool air wrapped around him. Behind him, the house did not react. While that should have comforted him, it did not. Standing on the porch, Daniel closed the door softly. Quietly, he rested his back against it. Across the yard, the mist moved low and slow. Because sound traveled poorly through it, distance felt uncertain. Alert again, Daniel scanned the ground and the trees beyond. Carefully, he stayed still. Near the edge of the porch, the railing felt slick under his hand. Although nothing touched him, the space felt watched. Stiff and alert, Daniel stepped off the porch. Slowly, his shoes met wet grass. Toward the lake, the yard sloped gently. While he had walked it many times, it felt unfamiliar now. Uneasy but drawn forward, Daniel moved a few steps farther. Quietly, he stopped. In the mist, something darker than the rest seemed to settle. Because it did not move with the air, his pulse jumped. Frozen, Daniel focused on that patch. Slowly, his breathing shallowed. The shape did not advance. Although it held its place, the ground beneath it felt heavy. Torn between retreat and focus, Daniel stayed where he was. Quietly, he waited. Behind him, the house stood silent. While it offered no signal, the door at his back felt closed off. Isolated in the open, Daniel shifted his weight. Slowly, his heel pressed into the grass. The dark patch thinned. Because it faded rather than moved, confusion replaced fear. Cautious now, Daniel took one step forward. Quietly, the mist parted. Nothing remained. Although the space was empty, it felt used. Unsettled by that thought, Daniel stepped back again. Slowly, he turned toward the house. On the porch, the door looked unchanged. Because it held still, he approached carefully. Tired and cold, Daniel climbed the steps. Quietly, he reached for the handle. As his fingers touched it, warmth lingered. Although it had been cooled before, the change stood out. Stunned by the detail, Daniel pulled his hand away. Slowly, he stared at the door. From inside, a faint shift passed through the wood. While it wasn't a sound, it carried presence. Rigid with attention, Daniel leaned closer without opening it. Quietly, he listened. The shift came again, deeper this time. Because it aligned with the height of his chest, dread settled in. Uncertain and exhausted, Daniel rested his forehead against the door. Slowly, he closed his eyes. Inside the house, something waited. Although he could not name it, the sense felt patient. Cornered by fatigue, Daniel stayed still. Quietly, he realized the outside offered no distance. Behind his closed eyes, the house felt closer than before. While the night remained dark, it no longer felt empty. Drained of choices, Daniel stayed pressed to the door. Slowly, he understood that leaving had changed nothing. Against the wood of the door, Daniel stayed longer than felt reasonable. Although his legs ached, the stillness felt required. Quietly, the night pressed around him without sound. Slowly, he opened his eyes. In the weak porch light, the mist drifted lower. Because it moved without pattern, the yard lost its shape. Careful not to rush, Daniel stepped back from the door. Softly, his shoes brushed the damp boards. Near the edge of the porch, the air felt thinner. While nothing stood there, space itself felt marked. Uneasy and alert, Daniel leaned on the railing. Quietly, he listened past his own breath. Across the yard, the lake stayed hidden. Although water usually carried sound, it felt muted now. Distracted by that absence, Daniel focused harder. Slowly, his shoulders lowered. From somewhere near the ground, a faint shift passed through the mist. Because it wasn't sound or movement, it felt like pressure. Frozen, Daniel stayed where he was. Quietly, his pulse steadied into something dull. In the space where the dark patch had been, the air held. While nothing returned, the emptiness felt occupied. Reluctant to step closer, Daniel stayed back. Slowly, his fingers tightened around the railing. Behind him, the house remained closed. Because he did not turn, the door felt nearer than before. Cornered by indecision, Daniel exhaled through his nose. Quietly, he accepted that standing still was a choice. Near his feet, the grass bent without wind. Although subtle, the change caught his attention. Focused, intense, Daniel lowered his gaze. Slowly, he followed the line of flattened blades. The bend led nowhere. Because it ended abruptly, confusion followed. Unsettled by the incomplete sign, Daniel stepped back again. Quietly, his heel touched the porch step. In that moment, the porch boards creaked. While wood often shifted, this sound lingered. Still and listening, Daniel waited for it to finish. Slowly, it did not. From beneath the porch, a dull weight settled. Because it wasn't visible, his mind struggled to frame it. Rigid with attention, Daniel gripped the railing harder. Quietly, his jaw set. The mist around the porch thickened. Although the air cooled, the space beneath felt warm. Uneasy with the contrast, Daniel leaned forward slightly. Slowly, he peered down through the gaps between boards. Below, darkness held firm. Because light did not reach it, the space felt deep. Tired and wary, Daniel straightened again. Quietly, he stepped away. In the yard, the mist shifted once more. While it parted briefly, it did not reveal anything new. Alert but restrained, Daniel watched without moving. Slowly, his breathing stayed even. Behind him, the door gave a faint response. Although it did not open, the wood flexed. Stunned by the sensation, Daniel turned halfway. Quietly, his hand lifted without touching it. In that pause, the porch light flickered. Because it dimmed instead of shutting off, unease returned. Careful not to panic, Daniel lowered his hand. Slowly, he faced the yard again. The mist receded a little. Although distance returned, clarity did not. Drained by waiting, Daniel sat on the porch step. Quietly, his weight settled into the wood. From that lower angle, the yard looked different. While shapes remained the same, their spacing felt wrong. Uneasy but observant, Daniel studied the gaps between things. Slowly, he noticed they did not line up. Near the base of the trees, shadows gathered unevenly. Because the light failed to reach them, they felt closer. Tense again, Daniel pushed himself up. Quietly, he backed toward the door. At his back, the handle felt warmer than before. Although subtle, the change felt deliberate. Startled by the contact, Daniel froze. Slowly, his fingers rested there without turning it. From inside, a faint pull responded. While it did not force the handle, it waited. Worn down by the night, Daniel closed his eyes. Quietly, he let his forehead rest against the door. In that stillness, the yard felt distant. Although he stood outside, the house felt nearer. Cornered by sensation, Daniel stayed where he was. Slowly, he realized the space behind him was not empty. The mist shifted one last time. Because it drew closer to the porch, the yard shrank. Uneasy and resigned, Daniel remained pressed to the door. Quietly, he waited for something to change. Nothing did. Beneath the porch light, the waiting stretched thin. Although the night remained quiet, it no longer felt open. Tired in a way sleep could not fix, Daniel stayed pressed to the door. Slowly, the idea of leaving slipped away. Along the edge of the porch, the mist crept closer. Because it moved without sound, the yard seemed to retreat. Still and calm, Daniel watched it gather. Quietly, he accepted that distance was gone. Behind the door, warmth continued to build. While it should have cooled by now, it did not. Unsettled by the change, Daniel shifted his weight. Slowly, his back curved to match the wood. Inside the house, something adjusted. Although it made no sound, the pressure changed. Aware now of its patience, Daniel exhaled. Quietly, his shoulders dropped. Near his feet, the porch boards felt softer. Because they no longer felt firm, balance mattered. Careful not to stumble, Daniel widened his stance. Slowly, he steadied himself. The mist reached the steps. While it never touched him directly, the air thickened. Calm in a strange way, Daniel closed his eyes again. Quietly, he let the night settle. From behind the door, a gentle pull returned. Because it matched his height, the The contact felt personal. Still and accepting, Daniel did not resist. Slowly, he rested his forehead against the wood. The porch light dimmed further. Although it stayed on, its reach shortened. Unconcerned now, Daniel breathed evenly. Quietly, he waited. Inside the house, the warmth spread. While it never crossed the door, it filled the space behind it. Drained of urgency, Daniel stood without fear. Slowly, his thoughts softened. The mist wrapped the porch completely, because nothing beyond it mattered anymore. The yard vanished. Steady and calm, Daniel stayed where he was. Quietly, he listened to nothing. At the door, the waiting ended. Although nothing opened, the sense of separation thinned. Present and still, Daniel no longer leaned away. Slowly, he leaned in. In that final pause, the house felt whole. While the night remained dark, it no longer felt distant. Held without force, Daniel did not move. Slowly, he understood this was where he belonged.